So could states stop women from traveling across their borders to obtain abortions in another state? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So in a separate dissent, signed only by him, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh argued that states would not be able to stop residents from traveling across the border to obtain abortions in other states as a result of the constitutional right to interstate travel. This decision was filed by Justice Kavanaugh in response to some of the issues raised by the dissent in the case, as he otherwise supported the decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. Now, there's a little bit of irony with Brett Kavanaugh's assertion there, because, of course, nowhere in the Constitution does it specifically say that there's an interstate right to travel. Kind of like how nowhere in the Constitution does it specifically say that there's a right to an abortion, or to privacy for that matter. That being said, it is hard to argue with the idea that there probably is a clear constitutional right to travel. Just as I would argue, by the way, there's a clear constitutional right to privacy, which leads to a constitutional right to an abortion, but that's for another day. In another fit of irony, by the way, one of the clearest statements as to the limitations in one state to limit its citizens from getting the benefits that are offered in another state comes from a 1975 Supreme Court decision called Bigelow v. Virginia that was authored by Supreme Court Justice at the time, Harry Blackmun. Blackmun, of course, was a Republican appointed by Richard Nixon, who is also the author of Roe v. Wade. In this case, a New York abortion clinic had advertised in Virginia that it could provide abortion-related services to Virginia residents. In response to the case, Justice Blackmun wrote, quote, "The Virginia legislature could not have regulated the advertiser's activity in New York and obviously could not have prescribed the activity in that state. Neither could Virginia prevent its residents from traveling to New York to obtain those services or, as the state conceded, prosecute them for going there. Virginia possessed no authority to regulate the services provided in New York." Now, that's a pretty strong statement, but so are some of the statements in Blackmun's opinion in Roe v. Wade, which, of course, the Supreme Court then completely ignored. That being said, I do think that the odds of these laws restricting the right to travel across borders are unlikely going to find any support in even a conservative judiciary. The reason being clearly that the Constitution does include something, and that is what's called the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause of the Constitution comes from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution, which gives commerce the exclusive power to, quote, regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. Now, the way this clause has been interpreted is broadly, because you have to see in our federal system, as I describe it to my students, essentially each state is a separate country. And the residents of each state have citizenship in two countries, one being their state, the other being the United States of America. So in my case, for example, I am a citizen both of the state of Michigan and of the United States of America. And as such, the laws of both the state of Michigan and the United States of America impact me. That's why, for example, you pay two sets of taxes, one to the state, one to the federal government. And why the federal government has its own prisons and police forces, otherwise known as the FBI. But the way our federal system works is that the power that comes from the people actually goes to the states. And the only powers that the federal government has are powers that are directly granted to it by the Constitution. Now, the primary powers that are granted to the federal government under the Constitution are, number one, and quite obviously, foreign affairs, military affairs, that type of thing. And the other thing being commerce. Now, the problem that Congress has sometimes found itself in is that it wants to pass legislation to affect some issue that everyone supports, and yet the courts find that there's no basis in the Constitution for Congress to have that power. This has been the argument, for example, why for more than 100 years the federal government did not pass an anti-lynching bill. It's also why the Violence Against Women Act, passed by Congress, was thrown out by the courts. And it was the most serious challenge, by the way, that Obamacare faced in the courts, saved only by the fact that Chief Justice Roberts essentially used a workaround, saying that Obamacare represented a tax, which clearly the federal government has power to levy certain kinds of taxes. But otherwise, Obamacare probably would have failed in the courts. But where Congress has succeeded in passing legislation that seems only peripherally related to these two powers, it generally has done so under the Commerce Clause, arguing that the actions that it take impact interstate commerce. So, for example, there's a law called the Federal Arbitration Act, which states that if there's an arbitration clause in a contract, that any disputes between the parties essentially automatically goes to arbitration, doesn't go to the courts. Now, that law has been applied in certain kinds of state actions based upon the idea that you might have two parties from different states engaged in a dispute, and in those cases, the Arbitration Act would apply. So this clause has been applied broadly. So broadly, in fact, that there's this concept called the Dormant Commerce Clause, where what the issue is that certain states have tried to pass legislation that affect commerce in areas that Congress hasn't passed legislation. The idea being that if there were a conflict in the legislation between what Congress passed and what the states passed, then obviously Congress's legislation would prevail. But what the courts have said is, no, that's not the case. When it comes to commerce, that is the exclusive province of the federal government. So states can't even step into anything that might impact commerce. Now, that issue came up here in my home state of Michigan, where, as it turns out, we have some very big landfills. And as it turns out, the big city, Toronto, Canada, is just down the road from us. Well, Toronto wanted to send some of its garbage to our landfills. And guess what? Some Michigan residents weren't so happy about that. Well, despite the fact that Michigan wanted to take legal action to stop the garbage from coming into Michigan landfills, the courts made it clear that we couldn't do that because that would be interfering from commerce. Even though trash as commerce seems like kind of a dubious thing, and Congress had taken no steps to specifically allow trash to be shipped between other countries and the United States and between different states. So in other words, this clause has been interpreted broadly. And there's a reason for that. And what it has to do with is the actual nature of our union, which is that at its basis, the United States is two things. It's essentially a military alliance and a common market, much like what Europe is trying to do. Not surprisingly, Europe has struggled with the ideas of federalism, much as we had. I mean, you forget that we actually fought a war over this. And many of the struggles we're dealing with right now continue to be defined by this idea of federalism. So living in a huge, diverse country with essentially different states cooperating together, that's a tough thing to accomplish. But in the case of the United States, it's been spectacularly effective. I mean, the United States right now is by far the world's richest country, even though China's done a good job of trying to catch up to us. They have a long way to go before they catch up to the United States. And we are by far the world's most powerful country. So those two areas where the states decided they were going to cooperate, we've been enormously successful. And that is where I think the courts will stand against any kind of effort to restrict interstate travel. Because the danger, and this is what courts recognize, is that you can get onto a slippery slope with legislation very quickly. And before you know it, you'll all of a sudden start to see efforts to try to limit interstate commerce. And that is something that businesses cannot abide by. And that, of course, is what the courts are really concerned about. Well, if you want to check out another video about the influence of business in government, why don't you check out this video over here I did a while ago. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.